Good evening. Tonight's story is the weird little tale of The King Who Was Fried, as documented by Flora Annie Steel. Her book, Tales of the Punjab, Told by the People, was published in 1894, before the partition of India. Today, it isn't entirely clear whether these stories would be attributed to Indian or Pakistani origins. The story itself takes place in India and partially in Tibet. This is a weird, funny little legend with snobby swans, a bizarre magician, and pathologically generous kings, and I find it quite charming. I hope you will too. Now, let's open our imaginations and begin. Once upon a time, a very long time ago indeed, there lived a king who had made a vow never to eat bread or break his fast until he had given away 100 weight of gold in charity. So every day before King Karan, for that was his name, had his breakfast, the palace servants would come out with baskets and baskets of gold pieces to scatter amongst the crowds of poor folk who, you may be sure, never forgot to be there to receive the alms. How they used to hustle and bustle and struggle and scramble. Then, when the last golden piece had been fought for, King Karan would sit down to his breakfast and enjoy it as a man who has kept his word should do. Now, when people saw the king lavishing his gold in this fashion, they naturally thought that sooner or later the royal treasuries must give out, the gold come to an end, and the king, who was evidently a man of his word, die of starvation. But, though months and years passed by, every day, just a quarter of an hour before breakfast time, the servants came out of the palace with baskets and baskets of gold, and, as the crowds dispersed, they could see the king sitting down to his breakfast in the royal banqueting hall, as jolly and fat and hungry as could be. Now, of course, there was some secret in all this, and this secret I shall now tell you. King Karan had made a compact with a holy and a very hungry old fakir who lived at the top of the hill, and the compact was this. On condition of King Karan allowing himself to be fried and eaten for breakfast every day, the fakir gave him 100 weight of pure gold. Of course, had the fakir been an ordinary sort of person, the compact would not have lasted long, for once the king had been fried and eaten, there would have been an end of the matter. But the fakir was a very remarkable fakir indeed, and when he had eaten the king and picked the bones quite clean, he just put them together, said a charm or two, and hey presto, there was King Karan as fat and jolly as ever, ready for the next morning's breakfast. In fact, the fakir made no bones at all over the affair, which, it must be confessed, was very convenient both for the breakfast and the breakfast eater. Nevertheless, it was of course not pleasant to be popped alive every morning into a great frying pan of boiling oil, and for my part I think King Karan earned his 100 weight of gold handsomely. But after a time he got accustomed to the process, and would go up quite cheerfully to the holy and hungry one's house, where the biggest frying pan was spitting and sputtering over the sacred fire. Then he would just pass the time of day to the fakir to make sure he was punctual, and step gracefully into his hot oil bath. My goodness, how he sizzled and fizzled! When he was crisp and brown, the fakir ate him, picked the bones, set them together, sang a charm, and finished the business by bringing out his dirty, old, ragged coat, which he shook and shook while the bright golden pieces came tumbling out of the pockets onto the floor. So that was the way King Karan got his gold, and if you think it very extraordinary, so do I. Now, in the great Mansarovar Lake, where, as of course you know, all the wild swans live when they leave us and feed upon seed pearls, there was a great famine. Pearls were so scarce that one pair of swans determined to go out into the world and seek for food. So they flew into King Bikramajit's garden at Ujjain. Now, when the gardener saw the beautiful birds, he was delighted, and, hoping to induce them to stay, he threw them grain to eat. but they would not touch it, nor any other food he offered them. So he went to his master and told him there were a pair of swans in the garden who refused to eat anything. Then King Bikramajit went out and asked them in the birds' language, for, as everyone knows, Bikramajit understood both beasts and birds, why it was that they ate nothing. "We don't eat grain," said they, "nor fruit, nor anything but fresh, unpierced pearls." Whereupon King Bikramajit, being very kind-hearted, sent for a basket of pearls, and every day when he came into the garden he fed the swans with his own hand. But one day, when he was feeding them as usual, one of the pearls happened to be pierced. The dainty swans found it out at once, and, coming to the conclusion that King Bikramajit's supply of pearls was running short, they made up their minds to go further afield. So, despite his entreaties, they spread their broad white wings and flew up into the blue sky, their outstretched necks pointing straight toward home on the great Mansarovar lake. Yet they were not ungrateful, for as they flew they sang the praises of Bikramajit. Now, King Karan was watching his servants bring out the baskets of gold when the wild swans came flying over his head, and when he heard them singing, "Glory to Bikramajit! Glory to Bikramajit!" he said to himself, "Who is this whom even the birds praise? I let myself be fried and eaten every day in order that I may be able to give away 100 weight of gold in charity, yet no swan sings my song." So, being jealous, he sent for a bird catcher who snared the poor swans with lime and put them in a cage. Then Karan hung the cage in the palace and ordered his servants to bring every kind of bird's food, but the proud swans only curved their white necks in scorn, saying, "Glory to Bikramajit! He gave us pearls to eat." Then King Karan, determined not to be outdone, sent for pearls, but still the scornful swans would not touch anything. "Why will ye not eat?" quoth King Karan wrathfully. "Am I not as generous as Bikramajit?" Then the swan's wife answered and said, "Kings do not imprison the innocent. Kings do not war against women. If Bikramajit were here, he would at any rate let me go." So Karan, not to be outdone in generosity, let the swan's wife go, and she spread her broad white wings and flew southward to Bikramajit, and told him how her husband was a prisoner at the court of King Karan. Of course, Bikramajit, who was, as everyone knows, the most generous of kings, determined to release the poor captive, and, bidding the swan fly back and rejoin her mate, he put on the garb of a servant, and taking the name of Bikru, journeyed northward till he came to King Karan's kingdom. Then he took service with the king and helped every day to carry out the baskets of golden pieces. He soon saw there was some secret in King Karan's endless wealth, and never rested until he had found it out. So one day, hidden close by, he saw King Karan enter the fakir's house and pop into the boiling oil. He saw him frizzle and sizzle, saw him come out crisp and brown, saw the hungry and holy fakir pick the bones, and finally he saw King Karan, fat and jolly as ever, go down the mountainside with 100 weight of gold. Then Bikru knew what to do. The very next day he rose very early, and, taking a carving knife, he slashed himself all over. Next, he took some pepper and salt, spices, pounded pomegranate seeds, and pea flour. These he mixed together into a beautiful curry stuff and rubbed himself all over with it, right into the cuts in spite of the smarting. When he thought he was quite ready for cooking, he just went up the hill to the fakir's house and popped into the frying pan. The fakir was still asleep, but he soon awoke with the sizzling and the fizzling, and said to himself, "Dear me, how uncommonly nice the king smells this morning." Indeed, so appetizing was the smell that he could hardly wait until the king was crisp and brown, but then, oh my goodness, he gobbled him up. You see, he had been eating plain fried so long that a deviled king was quite a change. He picked the bones ever so clean, and it is my belief he would have eaten them too had he not been afraid of killing the goose that laid the golden eggs. Then, when it was all over, he put the king together again and said, with tears in his eyes, "What a breakfast that was, to be sure! Tell me how you managed to taste so nice, and I'll give you anything you ask." Whereupon Bikru told him the way it was done, and promised to devil himself every morning if he might have the old coat in return. "For," said he, "it is not pleasant to be fried, and I don't see why I should in addition have the trouble of carrying 100 weight of gold to the palace every day. Now, if I keep the coat, I can shake it out down there." To this the fakir agreed, and off went Bikru with the coat. Meanwhile, King Karan came toiling up the hill, and was surprised when he entered the fakir's house to find the fire out, the frying pan put away, and the fakir himself as holy as ever, but not in the least hungry. Why, what is the matter?" faltered the king. "Who are you?" asked the fakir, who, to begin with, was somewhat short-sighted, and in addition felt drowsy after his heavy meal. "Who? Why, I'm King Karan, come to be fried. Don't you want your breakfast?" "I've had my breakfast," sighed the fakir regretfully. "You tasted very nice when you were deviled, I can assure you." "I never was deviled in my life," shouted the king. "You must have eaten somebody else." "That is just what I was saying to myself," returned the fakir sleepily. "I thought it couldn't be only the spices that snore, snore, snore." "Look here," cried King Karan in a rage, shaking the fakir. "You must eat me too." "Couldn't," nodded the holy but satisfied fakir. "Really, not another morsel, no thank you." "Then give me my gold," shrieked King Karan. "You're bound to do that, for I'm ready to fulfill my part of the contract." "Sorry, I can't oblige, but the other person went off with the coat," nodded the fakir. Hearing this, King Karan returned home in despair and ordered the royal treasurer to send him gold. So that day he ate his breakfast in peace. And the next day also, by ransacking all the private treasuries, 100 weight of gold was forthcoming. So King Karan ate his breakfast as usual, though his heart was gloomy. But the third day, the royal treasurer arrived with empty hands, and, casting himself on the ground, exclaimed, "May it please your majesty, there is not any more gold in your majesty's domains." Then King Karan went solemnly to bed without any breakfast, and the crowd, after waiting for hours, expecting to see the palace doors open and the servants come out with the baskets of gold, melted away, saying it was a great shame to deceive poor folk in that way. By dinner time, poor King Karan was visibly thinner, but he was a man of his word, and though the wily Bikru came and tried to persuade him to eat by saying he could not possibly be blamed, he shook his head and turned his face to the wall. Then Bikru, or Bikramajit, took the fakir's old coat and, shaking it before the king, said, "Take the money, my friend, and what is more, if you will let the wild swans you have in that cage at liberty, I will give you the coat into the bargain." So King Karan set the wild swans at liberty, and as the pair of them flew away to the great Mansarovar lake, they sang as they went, "Glory to Bikramajit, the generous Bikramajit." Then King Karan hung his head and said to himself, "The swan song is true. Bikramajit is more generous than I. For if I was fried for the sake of 100 weight of gold and my breakfast, he was deviled in order to set a bird at liberty." This story cracks me up. I love how King Karan is willing to go to these extreme lengths in order to be admired by his people, and yet he's not really a good or a kind person. He's just doing it for the gram. The first story on this channel back in January was also from this story collection. Flora Annie Steel was the wife of an English civil servant who was stationed in the Punjab. She was very interested in traditional Indian life and culture, and the birth of her daughter gave her a special way to connect with the local women and children. She collected these stories by talking with the children in the village and listening to various different versions of the same tale and piecing together an adaptation from these different tellings. Over time, she wrote several books about Indian culture and folklore, including a book on Indian housekeeping and cookery and a very well-respected history of India. As you know, if you listen all the way to the end of the video, I make a little confession out here. This week's confession is that this week has been hard, y'all. I read this great book of short stories and I was very excited to share some of them with you, and I started working on the scripts and gathering all the assets and doing all the research when I discovered that the author was repeatedly accused of essay of young boys. So of course I couldn't do any of those stories, although I'd already spent a lot of time on it. So then I started reading these other stories from Africa and then exploring all these interconnected mythologies with stories from Europe and Asia. And I was going to share a story with you with 3 different tellings of the same story from different regions of the world. It was very cool. And yet every version of the story had progressively greater violence against the wife until I had something that I just really couldn't feel good about sharing. So then I was feeling a little anxious because I'd spent a lot of time on things I wasn't going to do, and so I was reading another story, and right towards the end, the author dropped the N-word. So, my plan was not to do another story by the same author within the same year, but I needed something that was light and easy and quick, and I find this story really charming, so here we are. The truth is that we all struggle with the ambiguity and the moral responsibility of the culture we consume. We're all aware that some of the best and most famous works of media and culture were created by really terrible people. And traditionally, we would separate the work from the person and analyze and understand them differently with acknowledgement that attitudes and expressions have changed over time. I think that's a conversation definitely worth having, but I do not feel like this is the platform for it. And I don't want to knowingly be part of enhancing a legacy that I think is harmful. So I think these kinds of struggles are an unfortunate side effect of dealing with this kind of material. And for me, some weeks are just better than others. This is Restored Lore, where I do find wonderful old stories, myths, and legends, and I try to connect them with new audiences. If you like the odd and the curious, the strange and the mysterious, and prefer your fiction and word-free, subscribe to this channel. Leave me a comment, like this story, and enable notifications so you never miss out. See you next week.